Hi, everybody. It's so nice to be here with you all. My name is Santana Drever. I am the program assistant here at Sacred Earth Solar, and today we're having the third part of our Just Transition webinar series in partnership with Indigenous Climate Action. Today's webinar is called Policy for the People, and I'm really excited to learn and be together. And we have some really awesome panelists here today who are gonna share a bit of their knowledge that they've accumulated in their bundles. So today our webinar will be recorded and there will be a $75 cash prize if you fill out a survey from 1 week to today, Thursday, November 26th. So that will be followed up in the emails that you registered with. Today we have communities of color operating in allyship, COCA for ASL interpretation. And we have Elena Starrett doing a graphic recording with GISGAT, her graphic recording organization. So at the end of the panel, we'll pull up the graphic recording and see what she's been working on throughout the course of our discussion today. And today's guests are Clayton Thomas Mueller, Ariel Diranger, T'Challa Ace Harry, and Freddie Campbell. So without further ado, I'll start handing it over to our panelists to do an introduction. So I'll pass it to Ariel first. Thank you.
I'm going to start my introduction in my language. So for the ASL interpreters, it won't be English. Eklanete, dene sotlaneta, Ariel Tseekwe Hushe, Deranger Betsini Hasli. So hello, my name is Ariel Tseekwe Deranger. I am a member of the Athabasca Chippewan First Nation, Treaty 8 territories of Northern Alberta, but I currently live and reside in the Enoch Cree Nations territory in Treaty 6, and I'm the executive director and one of the main contributors and writers with the JT Guide, and I'm really excited to be here today to be a part of this really rich discussion on policy. So thank you, Masicho.
Thank you, Ariel. I'll pass it to Clayton to introduce himself next.
Buju, same with Ariel, just real quick, ref protocol reading in my language. Well, actually, funny story, being an urban native, growing up in Winnipeg, but being Cree from up north, I actually pray and introduce myself in Ojibwe because it's all a bunch of schnobs around here in Winnipeg, and us Crees are up north. So, Buju, Tanse, Zongabinesi and Anetish Nakas, can you thought them? Yeah, so as mentioned, my name's Clayton. I'm a Cree man from Pugatawagan Cree Nation, and I'm an author and a recovering elite global campaigner. But I've taken a step back and I'm finding other ways to contribute to the movement, through the arts. And so, yeah, but I still continue to participate, and I'm a huge fan of Sacred Earth Solar and the incredible team there, as well as Indigenous Climate Action. I'm one of the people that helped start ICA back in the day, and I'm one of their biggest cheerleaders. So I'm really happy to be here. I was a part of the Indigenous Tar Sands campaign for the last 20 years now. We've been fighting against the tar sands and its associated pipeline infrastructure, as well as shipping lanes and refinery upgrades all across Turtle Island. And, the story of that campaign is not done yet. And yeah, I'm really happy to be here today and talk policy and just transition. And I'm even more excited to see everybody who's tuning in today on the streets in New York City for New York's Climate Week. So, Igosima.
Thank you, Clayton. Next, we'll hear from T'Challa Ace Harry to introduce herself.
Thank you. Chepot Ace at Mamatlanan T'Challa's Kaimoknan's Tauch Tishosam Hega Op. Has Mame Harry at Mun Otka Questionaya has Catrin Harry at Tan has Mabel Mary Francis it's Chicho Hega Ernest George Harry at Cookbo. Hello, my English name is Ace Harry. My Kaimok name or my traditional name or my ancestral name is T'Challa. I come from Ishosam and Op or Slyaman and Church House. So those are the names of the plots of land that our reserves are now on. And my family, my parents is Plastanaya and Katrin Harry, and my grandparents are Mabel Mary Francis and Ernest George Harry. I'm Coast Salish. I'm one of the young people that has been a part of the wave of young people that are making the choice to move home. I moved home January of last year. Previous to that, I was going to school in Victoria, BC, trying to pursue higher education and some sort of post-secondary path that, you know, have been presented to me as the best way to bring positive things back to my home community. And then I found myself in land defense spaces, and through the people that I've met there, I've completely changed the way that I view the path forward for my people, and especially considering you know, a climate change timeline that we are all faced with. Moving home was definitely the most powerful thing that myself and a lot of my peers in Clom and in Hamalco can see for providing leadership for our people, and that's rooted in connecting with our family members in person on a daily basis, one-to-one as much as possible, and actually understanding the needs of our people as personally as we can. So that's the work that I'm participating in now. We're currently engaged in projects around trying to generate conversations about our territory amongst our young people, and that includes, you know, one of the biggest sockeye-bearing rivers on the west coast of BC. Currently known as Pal River. It was dammed in the early 1900s, and so generating a conversation about what to do with that site now, because the pulp mill that it was dammed for has been defunct for, you know, a few years now after standing for less than 100. So that's my place as a young person, trying to, alongside all of my peers, trying to find out what the best way to approach our responsibility as stewards of our ancestral territories. And being Coast Salish, you know, our first contact was in the 1760s. So we're quite close to grandparents that never knew anything except living on our territories. And so finding our ways to stand in that responsibility with that proximity to our ways of life. Yeah, thank you. That's me.
Thank you so much, Tishala. I'll pass it to our final panelist, Freddie.
Merci, Santana. For the ASL interpreters, I'll also introduce myself in Michif. Tantse Kiowau, Freddie Pick Campbell, Dishnika Sean, Kutne Chinia Maka, Ni Mama Lian Yupe, Shinika Sean, Ni Papa Peter Campbell, Shinika Sean, Kakiowama Parentee. Hello, folks. My name is Freddie Yupe Campbell, pronouns she, they. I was born and raised urbanly on Tanaha territories in the Kootenay region. I hold Michif ancestry on my maternal side. My mother's name is Leanne Hupe. My grandparents are from so-called Lac La Biche. And I also hold Irish, Scottish, and British ancestry on my paternal side. My father's name is Peter Campbell. Very grateful to be here with all my relations today. I'm a Two-Spirit Michif human, and I'm currently the director of the energy and climate team at Indigenous Clean Energy, which encompasses our national and our global programming. Indigenous Clean Energy works to build capacity by, for, and with Indigenous nations through a variety of different programs. We've trained over 400 Indigenous clean energy champions over the past 9, I think almost 10 years now, and are consistently growing and adapting our programming to support an Indigenous sovereign future in whatever way that means for the communities we work with. We've also expanded our programming on a global level and are working with specifically over 4 different countries on some collaborative capacity building programs, so-called Australia, Aotearoa, or so-called New Zealand, in Colombia and Ecuador. And we're also supporting a variety of other countries through our policy and advocacy work as well. So very grateful and honored to be here today. to talk about some different areas in the just transition that we can continue to support. Kitchi Marcy, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Freddie, and to our other panelists for introducing yourself. I'll just quickly add that I'm calling in from Squamish territory in North Vancouver, but I am a Cree and Saulteaux girl from Treaty 4 and 6 in Saskatchewan, so I'm a very grateful guest on these lands that I'm having this conversation with you all today. So without further ado, I'll jump into our first question. And I'll ask Ariel this question first. How can Indigenous perspectives and worldviews influence policies required for a just transition?
I think that that's a really, really great question to start. And I know that there has been such incredible conversations that have already happened up to date in this webinar series. But I think when it comes to how we move from this idea of Indigenous peoples leading just transition to the actualization of that, we have to understand some of the barriers as well. And I think right now what we're seeing is that Canada, oh, did I cut out? No, okay, sorry, I thought I cut out. Is that in Canada, Canada has made huge commitments within the Paris Agreement, the international UN agreement to address the climate crisis, to reduce our emissions by 30% from 2005 levels. And within the movement since 2007, 2015, when the Paris Agreement was signed, there has been a lot of effort for understanding the critical role that Indigenous peoples, our rights, our knowledge, and our culture has in helping to achieve the reduction of emissions globally. However, that recognition of Indigenous rights, knowledge, wisdom, lifeways, and rights as being critical has been degraded to us only giving recommendations to government rather than actualizing our full sovereignty and self-determination. This degradation from the recognition of our rights to the implementation and upholding of sovereignty and self-determination has led to a lot of power struggles. So in Canada's policies, the main federal policies on climate change, which include a healthy environment and a healthy economy, and the Pan-Canadian framework on clean growth and climate change, they developed these initiatives to help reduce emissions. But there was no substantial ways for Indigenous rights and Indigenous peoples' culture, wisdom, and knowledge to be actually implemented into this. Additionally, the government has actually degraded their commitments, and instead of looking at a just transition strategy, which they had committed to early on in their commitments to address the climate crisis, they have reduced a just transition strategy to be called a Sustainable Jobs Act, which looks simply at jobs. This is really problematic because in the previous presentations we've seen in this webinar series, for a just transition for Indigenous peoples, it's not just about windmills and solar farms and hydro projects or whatever is being classified and highly recognized and touted as sustainable energy systems, but it is about the restoration of our culture, about our lifeways, about our connections to the land, about our languages, about our hunting, fishing, trapping, and conservation and biodiversity management that we have inherited through intergenerational knowledge exchanges that are critical to us, not just reducing the numbers on a chart for reducing GHGs, but about reevaluating how we relate to the land. And this is really, really critical because, again, current policies don't actually want to look at what it would mean for us to shift from just simply looking at things from an economic perspective, jobs, or a reduction of GHG perspectives, which is just numbers on a chart to help us meet the commitments of the government, but rather how we address the historical wrongs of the federal government that have resulted in our communities living in economic deserts, living in energy deserts, and not having access to the sort of the energy systems and the economic structures that have bolstered settler society in Canada to have and assume all the power. I think secondarily, one of the things I want to state is that we have done a lot. Indigenous peoples have done a tremendous amount of work to influence policy in this country. From the work in my region in the Alberta tar sands and in Treaty 8, what we have seen is that our communities have intervened in projects that are high emitting, high GHG emitting projects, to projects that are desecrating and demolishing critical ecosystems that are necessary to help stabilize GHGs in the atmosphere. And we have advocated for stronger policy on biodiversity management. We have advocated for stronger policies on resource management. And ultimately, we have advocated that Indigenous communities like my own are being adequately compensated for resources being extracted from our lands and territories. And we did all of this by utilizing a rights-based framework. And I think this is really important because we didn't go in there and say, oh, you have to do this for the climate. You have to do this to support like energy transition. We did this because we said these projects and the structures and the systems that supported them were ignoring our culture and our rights and our ways of being and what it means to be Dene or Dene people. And so what we came forward was on a platform that as Dene people, we were losing access to critical lands and territories. We were seeing the decline, significant decline in critical species associated with our culture and values, namely caribou and bison, but also moose and other smaller migratory birds. And we saw a degradation to our water systems, which are also our transportation routes as a remote flying community. We also said that these things had socio impacts on our people because of the loss of access to these critical parts of our culture and identity as Indigenous and Dene people of the region. And that these things were not just damaging the environment and exacerbating the climate crisis, they were essentially a part of the destruction and degradation of our culture and our rights. Chief Alan Adam of my community stated that they were committing cultural genocide, and that if they completely destroyed the Delta where we come from, then who are we as Dene people? Because our traditional name is Kaitale Dene Sotlene, which means people of the Delta, people of the willow, essentially. And so when you destroy that area, then who are we? So what happens is that knowledge, that intergenerational knowledge for thousands and thousands and thousands of years that my people have accumulated for managing our river systems, managing our species, caribou, bison, moose, even the wolves and the fish and the migratory birds, was a critical component to us building a just transition. Because the biggest and scariest part is that if we just talk about transitioning from oil and gas to a more sustainable energy method, we are missing a critical component of how we address the historical wrongs and start to remediate the damages done to our lands, territories, and to rebuild our cultures. A critical component of just transition must include support for the revitalization of those cultural practices. That in our community right now, ACFN has built the largest off-grid solar farm in the country. And that's incredible. But what we have found is that the policies are so restrictive to us being able to do that, that we have to find good suppliers to help deliver this energy. And the supplier ends up being a major producer or a major player in the oil and gas industry. And ultimately, at the end of the day, this company is benefiting more than the individuals receiving the energy at the output. And so policies continue in this country to benefit settler society, colonial governments, and colonial corporations. And our communities continue to struggle to find policies that actually allow us to access adequate funding, resources, power in decision-making to adequately address our needs as Indigenous peoples. Again, those needs are not just jobs, not just reduction of emissions, and not just protection of conservation of biodiversity to preserve somewhere else, but how we integrate all of those systems together and build new economic models, new energy models, and new systems that take into consideration the true values of the Indigenous communities of those regions. And I also need to name that there is no one solution for this. We are not pan-Indigenous. I'm speaking specifically to the experiences of the Dene and Cree people and Métis people of the Treaty 8 regions in the Peace Athabasca Delta region. But this model might not work in the Northwest Territories, in the Casca region. This might not work in for Ojibwe and Mi'kma'ki. And the types of energy models and systems that we need to create need to be co-created as we move towards true recognition of Indigenous peoples' rights and the upholding of international legislation or international declarations. Sorry, I lost the word there for a minute. Like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which advocates for governments and states to recognize our sovereignty, self-determination, and allow us to have free, prior, and informed consent. And this is critical if we are going to have real policies and real systems that are not just going to get locked into, again, reduction of emissions, counting the numbers on the spreadsheet to see how much GHGs have been averted, conserving biodiversity, but looking at a more holistic approach that includes the recognition of our knowledge and wisdom that we have accumulated over centuries and centuries and centuries, over millennia. And for us, this would create new systems where our knowledge would not only be respected, but would be implemented into new frameworks for how we move forward in a more just framework. This is where we start to talk about a just transition rather than just a transition. If we just focus on those things, the same big bad guys, Shell, Exxon, Husky, Imperial, they will be the ones leading the transition into the new energy system. A just transition requires us to look at how we're not just being absorbed into colonial systems, but how we're decolonizing these structures and making real room and real acknowledgement of our knowledge, our wisdoms, and ways of moving forward. I also think that in the JT guide, and I'm going to end here, there is so much that is being done and being advocated for by so many Indigenous peoples already. They are already impacting the sector on how we're moving to a just transition. And this is great. But what we need to be advocating alongside the good work of the people that are doing incredible work in shifting policy by the Canadian government is we need to simultaneously be looking at how we create our own independent sovereign policies and structures that can counter any policies that might lead to the degradation of our rights and culture. And part of this is that we absolutely have to be fighting back against the fossil fuel industry. There is, I believe, which page is this? On page 134 of the report, the CCPA reported that the fossil fuel industry recorded 11,452 lobby contacts with government officials from 2011 to 2018. The fossil fuel industry has been given a distinct advantage due to their significant financial resources and influence. And this influence seems to supersede our influence as Indigenous peoples, and yet we're the ones that are rights holders. And so we absolutely must be advocating for more voices from Indigenous peoples to state that we're not here to be told what the policies are. We're going to build our own policies and systems if your systems don't work for us, so that we can advance real just transition solutions that are not just about meeting your commitments in the international community, but about saving our culture, our rights, and our ways of being for future generations. And I really think that there's been such an incredible amount of work that's been done. And again, looking through the report, you can see the examples, countless examples of communities doing this, including the Haida Gwaii, as well as the Taku River Tlingit First Nation. There are so many communities that are at the forefronts of this right now. So thank you very much. And I'm excited to hear from some of the other panelists.
Wow, Ariel, spoken like a true matriarch. I feel so inspired and I'm really just lost for words and I don't even know how to follow that up. On our panel, I feel like we have those who have paved the way, like Ariel and Clayton, and then we have some youth as well. So it's really nice to learn from you, Ariel. And with that being said, I'll ask Clayton the next question. I feel like we have our auntie and our uncle, so I'll go to uncle next. From your perspective, how can Indigenous worldviews influence policies that are needed for a just transition?
Yeah, great question. I think that quite often, one thing you can always count on from Indigenous peoples and the data sets of Indigenous traditional knowledge that we take care of, is that usually things are pretty simple. Instructions from Kishimendu, original instructions on how to take care of the ecosystem, which is our responsibility as human beings, as members of the five-fingered nation. Race is a construct, a system of power and control used with other systems like toxic patriarchy and all that. And the only thing that really separates us from all the other animals that we have the sacred responsibility to speak on behalf of, because they can't speak, and I'm talking about our plant and animal relatives, are these guys right here, these little thumbs. That's the only thing that makes us special and different, okay? And so, when we think about climate policy, Ariel, I think, did a really good job just talking about the complexity and sophistication and, really deep millennia's old analysis that Native people bring to the table when we're talking about climate adaptation and mitigation. And certainly we're the world's leading experts collectively when we think about this idea of organizing and building power juxtaposed against the end of the world. Because for many of us, our world did end. It ended, with the birth of the settler colonial state of Canada. And we've been, organizing and, those strategies of organizing and interventions and straight up scraps have been informed by, thousands of years of observation and trial and error. And I think by the seven sacred teachings, because Native people are very kind. And, we've been very patient. And while some of our people have rightfully placed anger and are like, all the white people need to fuck off and go back to Europe, not everybody's really feeling that way, especially people like me who have mixed race kids. We're trying to find a more pragmatic solution in our land back struggle to other than, sending people across the pond. And of course, that kind of sentiment doesn't really apply in this era of the economics of the Anthropocene. In other words, we're living in an era of human related changes to our Earth's atmospheric carbon cycling capacity. We're literally have changed the chemistry of our sacred Mother Earth, of spaceship Earth, in the last 150 years of predatory capitalism. And quite frankly, I don't think Indigenous knowledge is enough to solve the problems that we're facing today. I think that it's going to require, as Ariel mentioned previously, regionally, bioregionally designed hybrid solutions that mix traditional Indigenous knowledge with Western science and probably a little pinch of just straight up belief and faith and magic, if we're going to get out of this mess that we're in. And I think for Native people, especially that are watching, it's important that we all come to the understanding that our power is rooted in this collective sense of identity and placement within the universe, that collectively we were placed where we live in our homeland to take care of it by Creator according to our creation stories. And so that what Westerners refer to as ownership, is really stewardship, I guess, in the English language. And all of our rights and ability to use those resources is really about the fact that we're headed in the same direction together. And so when it comes to, the current transformative change that we need, climate change requires tearing down our current economic model and building a new one. Now, this process offers massive human rights and economic justice opportunities. And right now, Indigenous Climate Action and Sacred Earth Solar and many others are building the most significant social movement in the history of the human species. Now, Indigenous peoples know, as I mentioned, what it means to organize power after the world has ended, because for us, it already did. We are the experts in rapid adaptation. And so, while we go through, the rinse and repeat strategies of building a safe space for our people to come together, we must always integrate, operation, mode of operation that includes what my good friend Ananda Tan talks about, in terms of social movement change theory. And that means every time we come together that we explore commonality. That should always be the number one goal. Number two, that we are always cultivating mutuality, finding the things that we have in common. Our struggle and liberation being bonded is a good thing. And of course, always acting in solidarity. This is an absolutely critical element to how Indigenous peoples and all oppressed peoples, build power and expand the political base of resistance. And so, I'm not telling you that there's cookie cutter or pan-Indigenous strategies that work. I think it's really important that we respect the sovereignty and self-determination of each individual First Nation that has a relationship with the settler colonial state of Canada. And that trust relationship, defined by Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution, by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, by ILO Convention 169, and many other legal instruments, both domestic and international. This trust relationship that we have as sovereign entities, it's sacred, right? It's defined by the numbered treaties and many other things. And so, it's really important that while we promote these methodologies for creating space for people to come together, that we explore those three pieces, all in the spirit of cross-movement pollination and solidarity across social movement sectors. And that means, groups like the International Solidarity Movement, that, stopped the World Trade Organization back in 1999. That means the anti-war movement, because climate change and foreign U.S. policy essentially means never-ending war. We've got to pull all these groups together. And the way to do that is not by asking them to join our cause, but by acting in solidarity with those groups and not having strings attached, and doing it in a good way with a strong anti-racist, anti-colonial, anti-oppression, decolonial framework, okay? And just letting it be. And trust me, when you do that kind of stuff, you'd be amazed who shows up at your birthday party. I'm going to leave it at that for now because I've been talking for a bit. Let's hear from some of the other panelists, and then we'll get more into it as we proceed on the panel.
Thank you so much, Clayton. I feel like from Ariel and Clayton both, we've heard about pan-indigenizing. And so next I want to hear from Freddie, our Métis panelist, to see how her perspective might be different from the panelists we've heard thus far. And so Freddie, from your perspective, how can your Indigenous worldview, your nation's worldview influence policy required for a just transition?
Yeah, thanks so much, Santana. I think it's a really good question. And I too will speak from my own perspectives, because I think there are many different unique communities and nations that hold their own views and identities when it comes to this work. I feel that our ancestors have sacrificed so much for us to be even speaking on the panel like this today and having these types of conversations. And I feel so honored and grateful that I get to show up as my absolute self. And I feel that, there's many pieces that are important in what a just transition looks like. I find that there's often a very large burden placed on Indigenous knowledge. And I think that it's important that there's a shared responsibility when it comes to this type of work. I think both Ariel and Clayton touched on that, in that it's about relationship building and what that means. And so when it comes even to policy, and when we're talking about how we're doing things differently and what that actually means, I would much prefer to sit down with a policymaker and have a conversation or have tea and build a good relationship and rapport, so that I know they understand what my views and perspectives are, and vice versa, and that there's that shared idea of responsibility and accountability, that we're both having a conversation about how we're going to move this forward in a good way, and that can expand to larger roundtables of folks having conversations about what the policy actually means for communities on the ground. So I think that piece and that idea of building good relations that infuses collective or more collective forms of decision making is very important when it comes to this work. I also think that allows for adaptation, and Clayton also touched on that. But I feel that there's such a necessity to have more flexibility and adaptation when it comes to policy work. We need to have policies that can be shifted depending on what the community needs are, and there has to be room and flexibility within that, so that we can assert the systems that we want. So I think that piece is also very relevant. I think supporting Indigenous definitions of a just transition is something that is very necessary. We are often prescribed to these very restrictive definitions and boxes, and many of us have our own views about what a just transition means to us. And I think that needs to be upheld and honored. I think another important piece is ensuring that we have the capacity and the support systems to do this work. And other panelists also noted this very eloquently, but ensuring that we understand what the colonial and capitalist agenda is, and that we can come together in order to fight back against it. I think that currently the clean energy transition is recolonizing our kin, both here and around the world. We see this all the time in our work, especially in the South. Our clean energy transition is being fueled by labor and resource exploitation in other parts of the world and here as well. And I think that's something that's not often talked about, because it's clean and it's green and it looks nice and it can be wrapped up in this package. However, that's not what the case is in reality. And I think it's time that Indigenous nations can come together, and we have, we're the second largest asset owners of renewable energy in this country right now. That's both a physical and a metaphorical place of power, and we have an opportunity to do things very differently. We can talk about supply chain of energy differently. We can talk about having Indigenous to Indigenous trade in a different way, and ensuring that we're not exporting and importing in a harmful way to our kin. We can look at Indigenous banks. There's so many different things, different forms of structures that we do not have to continue to perpetuate these forms of harm when it comes to new ways of being. So I think that there's many different things, and Indigenous people are just badass and brilliant. And if we can support one another, and if we can have that solidarity and that kinship grounded within everything that we do, including policy, but also including the pieces that trickle down from policy, I think that's going to make a large difference. So I'll leave it at that, but yeah, happy to add more later. Marcy.
Thank you, Freddie. That was so insightful, and you definitely said a lot that's going to stick with me moving forward. And so next, I want to go to Chikala Ace Harry and ask her about the importance of youth engagement in policy making. I know you mentioned your work in Victoria and you've recently gone home. So how can we uplift youth in policy making spaces? And can you speak to the importance of that as a young person yourself?
Great. Yeah. So as soon as I left high school, essentially, I really threw myself into these pathways that were presented to me as being pathways towards making an impact in policy. And I want to thank everyone for bearing with me as I feel out of practice being on a panel like this, talking about something like climate change policy, because since I've moved home, my main mission has been to engage my people personally, and my people don't talk like this. I think that one of the massive benefits that I've gotten from moving home is learning more of my language, and I've gotten closer to fluency than I ever hoped, like ever dared to hope I would get. And I moved home to spend time with my chichia, my grandmother. She passed away last August, and I was given the very profound privilege of spending her last 6 months with her, as much as I possibly could. But it took me that long to gather the courage to see the value in my language, and I will forever be grateful that I was able to get there, because growing up, I was taught a lot of things about what the value of my life was going to be. And it was presented as, entering policy. I think I've since realized that the thing that my language has offered me is coherency. It's offered me an insight into what my place is on my territory, to the point where colonial lies, false solutions, they're a lot easier for me to identify, actually, since learning more of my language. And I think that it's important that I do everything in my power to provide that opportunity to other young people from my territory to learn our language, to have better ways of talking about what a liar colonialism is. We're constantly lied to about colonialism. We're lied to about its legitimacy, about its age. In my people's history, colonialism is incredibly young. We're lied to about its functionality. We're lied to about what the rest of the world looks like outside of the West in order for us to live the way that we do. And what that results in is fine, average people not understanding their political impact globally. We're given strategic definitions as well of things like, I think you'd be really hard pressed to find communities that have shared definitions of something like decolonization. Even racism is something that's very hard to define. And I've found that bringing those concepts back to the core concept of what colonialism is really helpful in that conversation. And it's important that we try to find those shared definitions, because first of all, it makes it easier to talk to people, especially community members, because not all of us, I was invited here by my dear friend Willow Prince. We met doing work at COP15 in Montreal, December, I think 2022. And that was my first time in a UN space. And I went in there really excited to see like just what all the hype was about, like where the space that I was encouraged to go personally by many Mamafla, or like non-Indigenous people, who said like, this is the best place for you to go to make change. And then since then I've come home, and I realized that in the few short years that I was gone, my territory is fundamentally different than it even was 3 years ago. And that's because we are on track. The World Meteorological Organization released like a climate update, their like global annual to decadal climate update recently. And I just remember reading in that while I was like kind of pursuing that work, that we're on track, for that warming mark, the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming mark by 2027 at that time. So I think that this conversation would look a lot different about like what Indigenous perspectives can bring if we had more time.
I think that that report also said that we're on track to lose 95% of global languages by the end of the century. And, you know, to me, as a Kaimuk person, like that's an extinction event for our species. I think that when you value Indigenous histories, when you value Indigenous languages, you are valuing actually the vast majority of memory that exists about our human presence on Earth. So I guess it's like a complicated question in my eyes, because my trajectory in my life, my path, the work that I'm choosing to do has been all over the place in the past few years. And I've come back to my language every single time. Because it's impossible to ignore the way that my language talks about my territory and the way that my territory looks today. We don't have a single tree on my territory left in Tla'amin, Comox, Humalco, or Clahoos, any of the sister nations' territories, big enough to even build a house post, you know, let alone a canoe. That's extinction for my people. That's the cedar is the foundation. Everything about my culture revolves around our relationship to our territory, and specifically these plants that have sustained us, these trees. So yeah, it's been said before, you know, when you take that away, like what is left is colonialism. And so to reject colonialism, to decolonize, even to have the goal of a livable planet at this point is a very radical statement. And so what I'm interested in as a youth is defining these concepts. Yeah, close. Defining these concepts with as much clarity as we can, because I don't see how we can have a genuine conversation about industry otherwise. What happens when you lose the last of the languages that remember non-colonial community, non-colonial legal systems, non-colonial connection to place, ergo exploitation? What happens when you incentivize all young people to leave their land and their communities when they're just teenagers? You destroy your legal systems, you destroy your security and your young people remembering their own histories. And these all have, you know, relation to ways of life that I'm familiar with from my people and in our ancestral ways, because we created stumbling blocks for human tendency to forget. You know, I've heard historians say that human history repeats itself in cycles of 75 years. And I think that that's a very new idea. And I think that our people actually understood that that happens when you do not mandate your youth to remember certain histories. And I think that those cycles are repeating themselves like extremely rapidly nowadays, and we think it's normal. You know, in BC, I hear young people talking about wildfire season. We had ecological processes to prevent wildfires in BC. We're not supposed to have a wildfire season. I'm not just concerned about, you know, my people's place in the workforce, in industry, in, you know, using our land in a way that's appreciated by colonialism. I'm concerned about my territory burning down and all the transient settlers who live here having the financial resources to up and leave, where my people will never leave. We simply don't have that option. And you know, we wouldn't have Section 35 if we didn't march. And I always come back to that as well. I think that what it looks like when we assert our sovereignty as Indigenous people, when we assert our right to exist, it looks as a specific way. And I really respect, at the end of the day, the strength of our people to still be here. You know, I represent the 1% of my people who survived the diseases in the 1860s, and I think about that every day. I think about how it's a miracle that I'm alive, and that there's a responsibility to that. So yeah, I think I went in a lot of different directions there, but I think that I think it's important to me, like what I've seen and how complicated these conversations get for my people to be familiar with how alienating these spaces can be for, you know, most people, I would say, in my community. Clarity is always the most important thing to me. And at every turn, I think it's important to name colonialism for what it is, which is it's deceitful and it's predatory. And if we're going to have the tools to powerfully and from a position of strength identify and call out colonialism for its lies as they happen, even if they sound sweet, even if they sound green, it's going to require sharing these definitions and being aware of the histories and the agenda capitalism, because it's never changed. You know, the land theft has been a continuous process on my territory, and I see the impacts of that every day because my territory is a sacrifice zone. It's a tree farm, and I don't know what a forest is supposed to look like on my territory. And that's the most significant piece to me, and everything that I do stems from that understanding that I don't see a continuation of the existence of my people without a continuation of our forests. And at the end of the day, it will always come down to that for me. Checha Hatash, thank you.
Wow, Chikala, that was so amazing. I feel so inspired, and you're so right. It is a nuanced question when policies are quite literally what oppress our people, and trying to find a way as a Native person in the policy space is conflicting in itself. And I think your commitment to language really stood out to me. You know, policy, we don't have a word for that in my language, and I'm Korean Soto, and in my language, everything is animate, you know, rocks and dirt and trees. And so our connection to land and the way language shapes those concepts is so important. So thank you so much for your contributions. I see in our chat here that that Ariel wants to elaborate. So I'll pass to Ariel and let her elaborate.
I think I really wanted to say thank you so much for your sort of intervention, or what you have added to the conversation. I think that there is this important understanding that when white settler society sees Indigenous peoples in spaces like this, in a webinar to talk about just transition and policy, when you talk about you're the 1% that survived, you're also part of the 1% that has been able to adequately figure out how to walk in the two worlds. And that as our people, we're not just struggling with the climate crisis, we are living within compounding crises that have been designed through systems of colonization. And that in our own communities, this is not how we speak of these things. If I were to speak the way I did in my own community, they would tell me to slow down and talk like a normal person. And I think that this is really important around how we're constantly having to translate ourselves all the time to appease settler society, to be valued in the conversations around policy and transition. And this is really critical because some of the actual stories that are critical to understanding why we do this work comes from prophecy and is told in language that would not be respected or valued by settler society and colonial governments. In 2009, I was really lucky to participate in a global conference, a global Indigenous summit on climate change in Anchorage, Alaska, where the Anchorage Declaration was created. And at that meeting, there was this little side session, to be honest. It was like in a really weird room. And there was a Nupiaq elder talking about prophecy. And I can't remember their name, and I forever will feel bad about not being able to give credit where credit's due. But they talked about the prophecy that we had as Indigenous peoples is that we survived the last ice age. We survived a massive change of climate on Mother Earth already once before. And in order for our people to survive that climate change, that massive change on the planet of the last ice age, our people called for a grand council of people to come together to share our knowledge, to share our wisdom of being on the lands in different types of ecosystems, different types of weathers, foods that would be able to be maintained, that we shared our wisdom and knowledge in order to survive. And at that time, as we were able to move through to survive that ice age, there was a great prophecy that that the last ice age was not the only time that we would experience great shifts. And another great shift of even bigger proportions would come once again. And in order for our people to survive, we would have to come back together to share our wisdom, to share our knowledge of the land, to share our foods, to share our ways of survival in order for us to survive this time. And the prophecy is that we are now in this time. And that prophecy matches so incredibly well to the eagle and condor prophecy, which talks about how when the eagle and condor comes together and meets again, we will have to be moving through an emergence of great transition for our people. And through globalization and colonization, which has led us to have to come back together to support each other, we are in a time of incredible transition that our ancestors prophesized. And for us, again, when we talk about what does it mean for us to include, how do we translate that into colonial policy? There is no way, because their policy is so detached from our spirit, from Creator, from Mother Earth. It is about control. It is about ownership. And this is where we run into these challenges of what it means for us to lead a just transition strategy. And while there is so much work that is being done to bridge those gaps and those tables of conversations between colonial systems and structures and sitting down with policymakers in colonial governments, and we do need that, but that is a step towards our end goal, which is sovereignty and self-determination. It is not the end goal to have representation in colonial systems. The end goal is for us to finally be respected as sovereign nations that are able to uphold and fulfill our roles and responsibilities in relationship to creation, to Mother Earth, and our communities where we come from. And I just get very frustrated because in my community, we are not just dealing with the expansion of the Alberta tar sands and the climate crisis. We are dealing with epidemics of drug addiction, suicide, unemployment rates, isolation, and so many things. And do you know what has had more meaningful impact on the crises in our community is not policy. It is the action of our community members to restore our language, get our youth back onto the land, get our hands back into the dirt, allow us to see value in our culture and identity. And it is not coming from policy, but it is coming from the action of our knowledge holders, our land users, and our elders. And we can't write that in policy. It has to be about how we're living our real responsibilities as Dene, as Indigenous, Ojibwe, as Métis, as who we are in our communities. And I just really, really, really want to thank ACE for bringing that to the forefront, because our prophecies and our knowledge is not something that I didn't hear. Like, you know, this is intergenerational. This is through the millennia. And the time that colonization has been here has been a blink in the eye of what our lived understanding of these places really are. And that has never been respected by colonial governments. Thank you. I'm done. Sorry. Maybe that wasn't clear.
Thank you, Ariel, for elaborating. I love seeing the intergenerational conversations that happen in our communities. So next, I'll ask for some community highlights, and I'll go to Clayton for this question. Can you provide an example of policy changes that were championed by Indigenous communities?
Yeah, I think probably you know, one of the really good ones that I always appreciated, but also equally as frustrating as it is exciting and like a victory in our social movements, was actually the work of ICA director Ariel Deranger and you know, Melina, the director of solar energy, myself, many others were involved in that work. But you know, a lot of the financial risk campaigning that you see happening today, you know, the targeting of banks over their fossil fuel investments, the targeting of major hedge funds and different funds like BlackRock and the big investment management firms out of Europe that manage the big like California Teachers Union and other unions like the Canada Pension Fund, for example. A lot of the work targeting the financial sector and their apolitical stance on climate destroying investments was scrutinized by grassroots Indigenous leaders like Ariel. And there was a campaign that we put together targeting the 5 major banks here in Canada, and in relation, the international financing regime that they all subscribe to in terms of their social lending policies. And what highlighting the horrific impacts of Royal Bank of Canada's investments in specifically the tar sands, but really in the entirety of Canada's fossil fuel sector and high carbon intensity extractive sectors, we were able to create enough brand damage and embarrass the country of Canada enough and the clients of RBC to force the international institution that controls banking policy, in other words, that sets the trends, to consider changing their social lending policy to incorporate, a free, prior, and informed consent test. So banks would have to have guarantees from their clients that they have acquired the free, prior, and informed consent of communities impacted by the development that the investment was sponsoring. And so this was a huge freaking victory, because this didn't just impact Royal Bank of Canada and the other 4 big climate criminals here in our economy, in our jurisdiction. It affected all banks across the planet. And the vulnerable ones, such as the Royal Bank of Scotland, that had a bunch of investments in the tar sands and other dirty energy projects that got nationalized during recession. They divested, and we won that campaign, and there was great momentum. But unfortunately, like, for example, Alberta's climate policy, the really shitty climate policy, once the policy was created, they didn't continue funding the campaigns to test the policy and strengthen it from there. And so, there's a lot of work and a lot of remembering that current financial risk, financial campaigners, shareholder campaigners, and whatnot. There's a whole rich history of Indigenous campaigning in that sector that folks could learn from, I think, right now, and not recreate the wheel. Because I've seen that happen. But yeah, so that's a major one, was when Indigenous campaigning and organizing and storytelling and our worldview and cosmology shifted finance lending policy globally. But there's still, that story's not done. We need to continue the bank's campaigns. We need to continue to target BlackRock and other investment management firms, because the money, the trillions of dollars that we've moved out of fossil fuel through the international divestment campaign, which was started by Native people, we really need to build the power and targeting the reinvestment of those dollars so that they're prioritizing our communities that are disproportionately dependent financially on extractive industries. And certainly they need to prioritize those communities of workers who are working in the fossil fuel sector impacted by the transition off. Those stakeholders need to be first in line, when we talk about reinvestment, and of course, it all has to be informed by climate justice policy framework. Super simple, again, like I said, but if your climate policy isn't keeping fossil fuel in the ground, then it's a false solution at this stage in the game. You're basically working for them if your policy recommendation isn't keeping fossil fuel in the ground. If your recommendation is allowing fossil fuel to be extracted and burned, then you're being duped and suckered by the war profiteer type people who are profiting off of the climate crisis and its consumer-based solutions that are being marketed to us. That's it.
Oh my God, Clayton, that was so insightful. Thank you for sharing. It's really interesting as a young person myself, hearing from our, climate champions that came before us. So thank you so much for your work and for sharing. Next, I want to ask Freddie the same question, and just ask her to share any policy changes that were championed by Indigenous communities.
Yeah, merci, Santana. I'll speak a bit to the Indigenous clean energy space because policies, both provincially, territorially, and federally, have a significant impact on Indigenous clean energy projects. And I think there's a few areas that are very noteworthy and continue to be pushed from an Indigenous community perspective. One is around having equitable partnerships and fair partnerships, and I think that this is a piece that is still ongoing, but that comes with transparency, accountability, and opportunities for Indigenous nations to have free, prior, and informed consent when it comes to clean energy projects. This is a bare minimum standard when it comes to clean energy project practices, and there needs to be ongoing conversations about what this actually means, which is dependent on communities. Then I would say around the idea of ownership or co-ownership. Again, this also ties into free, prior, and informed consent, but these are policy areas that have been, depending on the province and the territory, have been regulated to ensure that Indigenous nations have opportunities to not only participate, but lead clean energy projects and own them if that's something that they would like to do. There have been very specific regulatory policies that have been necessary to ensure Indigenous nations have opportunities to participate in the clean energy transition. These are around, like there's been something called an Aboriginal adder policy or different utility incentives to ensure that Indigenous nations have priority when it comes to procurement. I recognize this is a lot of very jargony language as well, but policy does make a very big impact when it comes to pushing clean energy projects through or not. There are certain utilities which I think there's a whole nother conversation around utilities, but utilities currently are monopolizing the clean energy space. And we find this in all provinces and territories, I would say. There's been some shifts. There's currently a call for Power Up by BC Hydro that's advocating for Indigenous clean energy ownership of projects, but there's many things that are ongoing when it comes to utility policy that still need to be changed. Sorry, now I'm tangenting into a whole a whole clean energy nerdy space, but I do believe that when it comes to policy, the idea of ownership and co-ownership for Indigenous nations is very necessary. There also needs to be policy around capacity building to ensure that Indigenous nations do have support to build their capacity when it comes to participating in these processes. As mentioned, the fair and just partnership models that have been put in place when it comes to policy. And then I also just want to add to kind of something that Ace and Ariel were talking about earlier and that Clayton also touched on, but how does policy work translate to community and to our lives? And I think that that's a conversation that should be had more. Like, what does this actually mean? How are we putting humanness into policy work? How are we talking about Mother Earth when it comes to policy? What are the impacts of these policies in real life? And how are we ensuring that communities are informing policy work? And how are we ensuring that policy work is being informed by communities? Because I think it's that idea of having a reciprocal and ongoing relationship that's really needed. Yeah, I'll end there. Merci.
Thank you, Freddie. That's so true. I feel like when we talk about policy, it often seems very high level. And when you're grassroots, sometimes you kind of wonder how that translates from one end of the spectrum to the other. So that's a really good question. I'm definitely going to take that and ponder on it. So next I'll go to Ace and ask her if she has any policy changes that she knows of that were championed by Indigenous communities or people.
Yeah, I was really trying to sit with the question, and I think just in the way that my brain was going off in a lot of different directions, I know that my response to it will also be doing that. But I'm pretty sure Willow knew what they were doing when they invited me here today. So, um, no, honestly, I can't. I I think about our Aboriginal rights and title battles in court as having a profound impact on our relationship with colonial governments and industry. I think my main issue is that, again, I come back to definitions, having clear shared definitions of things, and I'm struggling to define like indigenous championed. Because of what, you know, Ariel was also pointing out, which is we're constantly struggling with the coercion of colonial conditions, and it's so hard to just show up in these spaces and maintain a respect for you know, the legitimacy of our systems. And I think that that's something that's very intentional. Like that's always been our dynamic with colonial governments. That's never changed, and I don't think that's a mistake. I think we're constantly when we enter, when we have a seat at the table, what we're grappling with is conditions that do seek to extinguish us as an identity. And it's important because the only thing that connects us to our land is our identity. It's what actually defines an Indian, you know, specifically under the Indian Act, right? Like, and what happens if you extinguish Indians? You remove the rightful title holders from having like a legal identity. And I think that that's like a really big piece of this conversation. Because Indigenous isn't inherently supposed to be a political identity. You know, it's a little bit of an oxymoron, even like no one's truly non-Indigenous to nowhere. Like we're all from somewhere, we all have history somewhere, we have lineage, we come from a place. What is being talked about when we talk about Indigenous people in BC, for instance, we're talking about having Aboriginal title, and that's a very political concept. So when I think about, you know, impacts that Indigenous champion causes have had on policy, I think about the Delgamuukw stay-away trial, and how that Supreme Court ruling, you know, that massive win for our people on the Northwest Coast, it created you know, a more distinctive definition of Aboriginal title in general. It created a definition, a more fulsome definition for, you know, duty to consult. It affirmed the legal validity of oral histories. So there's just like a lot of reasons why that was a step forward in having a respectful relationship with colonial governments when it came to our authority on our territories that we have never been removed from. And today that duty to consult has never been respected. We can say no however many times we want to. That win resulted in actually a massive push on the part of the federal government and BC towards modern treaty negotiations, a process that my sister nation Tla'amin has completed at this point. And so what I come back to is as someone who witnesses the impacts on my land every day, like I was talking about earlier, if our court rulings, if our Supreme Court rulings, if our successful wins in the Supreme Court of Canada are not respected, what will be? And the court systems, like those are things that the colonial governments swear by, that they demand we put our trust in, that they demand we believe in the legitimacy of. I think that's a really big ask at this point, and it's important that as Indigenous people we share in that feeling of being lied to in that way, because I've seen how illegitimate these court systems can be when it comes to our people. I have friends every year that go through that court system as a result of violating injunctions, you know, standing in the ways of pipeline expansions, and it's not a fair fight. Your lawyer swears a loyalty to the crown before you even get to them. you can't make certain arguments about Aboriginal title because that has an entire separate stream of the court system that you have to go through as soon as it touches anything near Aboriginal title. So I guess what that just comes down to when it comes to Indigenous champion is like, we need to be really clear on what our definition of Indigenous is. For me, I'm Indigenous not because of my blood, because I'm a half-breed. You know, I have a Mamafla mother. I've had many conversations amongst my family about what that means for me to you know, hold a position in my community. And I found that if you're doing the work, it's irrelevant if you have a connection to place that is indigeneity, which is what I was coming back to when I was saying no one's truly Indigenous. What's Indigenous is our way of looking at our territory. It's our mandate to protect the land that we live on and to be responsible for it. That's Indigenous. And I definitely argue, you know, that no one will respect our histories if we don't, no one's going to protect the authority of our elders, the dignity of our elders, our knowledge keepers, our first speakers, if we do not. And no one's going to respect our culture if we don't. And I have noticed that as I build a respect for all of those things that I just listed, it's become exponentially harder to platform myself. It's become harder to enter spaces to discuss things like policy. Once I truly actually spent time in my community as an adult. But I think it gets easier if more of us do it. Because there is something deeply predatory about the truth and reconciliation process as it's being carried out in Canada, where a select few Indians that are capable of showing up, that are resourced to show up, they're mandated to speak on behalf of everyone, and that is pan-Indigenization, and it is a massive problem. And the solutions to that, you know, it's the only solutions we have are collective ones. And so that's why for me it always comes back to community, because I don't see a continuation of my people if we can't simply gather and have a conversation. And the purpose of bringing up Delgamuukw Stay Away and then talking about its links to the, you know, the escalation of the modern treaty process is to talk about how modern treaty fractured my community at one of the most pivotal times politically for my people, as we were entering mainstream, as we were able to leave the reserve without permission from an Indian agent, as we were leaving the residential school system. We were put in these treaty negotiations that we were coerced into entering because of that imposed poverty. And that negotiation process completely fractured my community. I have family members that, because of previous generations, a previous generation, I never grew up with, first speakers that I don't have access to or didn't have access to, you know, as a child, because of those political divides that were manufactured by colonial governments. It's always, yeah, gunboat diplomacy. Thank you for that, Clayton. Like, it's that has defined our dynamic with colonial governments this entire time. And so it's important to, I think, approach concepts like Indigenous champion policy with that deep respect for the people that have come before us, that did everything in their power to challenge these systems that they recognized as being genocidal and inherently disrespectful. And it's important to realize that those dynamics have never changed. And I think that, you know, those people that were involved in those court cases, you know, there are elders in my community that tried to bring treaty negotiations to court and they were laughed at. It's important to take those stories seriously, because that is what you were met with if you don't meet settlers on settler terms. And so, not to say that I think I'm not trying to be all doomsday about it. Like, I truly think that my generation is filled with people, by no coincidence, that are coming up with these questions because of how disrespected, like, even our previous generation has been. And then not even to go into like how our elders have been treated and what they've gone through. And so it produces a generation of young people who deeply love these elders. Witnessing that, it produces generations of young people that are not interested in standing for that anymore. And And we've been lied to for a very, very long time. And you know, my people were only ever removed from our permanent village site, that the dam that I was talking about earlier, that's now Powell River, that was one of our most significant permanent village sites in our entire territory. We weren't removed from that until they imported smallpox from the gold rush in California around 1864, and sent it up and down the coast strategically. And they dictated that we would use blankets as currency to ensure the spread of infected blankets. Like, that's the only reason my people were ever removed from our territory. It's not like there was a war and we lost. And you're not taught about that. I think every single time I I talk to a young person from my community about this like political arena, every single time, like talking about smallpox in its severity, in its intentionality, like it's always shocking. Like, there are just so many parts of history that we're not encouraged to familiarize ourselves with, because they teach you about the inherent dynamic between Indigenous people and colonizers. And I think the consistency of that is just one of the clearest things about this conversation to me. And I think it's important that we get on side and have the freedom to talk to each other about what we're really faced with, because it's not a mistake that as soon as I entered post-secondary, I couldn't watch cultural material from my home community. I couldn't go on Facebook and see a video of people practicing our songs and our dances without feeling this immense pressure, like this guilt. And so whatever that is, I know that enough young people experience it, that it is real. And I didn't realize that that was something significant until I started talking to other people about it. And so as much as more of us can platform ourselves, develop our own relationships, see our own perspectives, and familiarize ourselves, articulate ourselves what it feels like to live in a settler colonial state, it's just going to get easier to identify those things and to call them out for what they are. And then I think you actually have a shot at sitting at the table in a way where you're not coerced into being there in the first place. But for me, it definitely all comes down to community. Yeah, I'll end that there.
Thank you, Ace. That's so powerful to, be asked for a policy example that has really worked, and to say, I don't have one, I don't know. I took training with Elaine Alec, who has her Cultivating Safe Spaces in British Columbia here. And in her training, she says that needing to know everything lies in white supremacy. Like, if you're invited somewhere, you have to know what to say and you have to have all the answers. Or what if they don't invite me back? And that's rooted in fear and control, fear of not being invited back, or fear of feeling inferior, or what have you. So it's so powerful to come online and say, I don't know, but here's what I do know, and that's Indigenous ways of being. So that's so amazing and awesome to see. I love how, despite the question, you're, so true to yourself. So next we'll go to Ariel for her policy examples, and then we'll go to Q&A and closing remarks after that.
I think that I'm going to make this super quick. I don't think that since the passing of the UN DRIP in 2007, so the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007, and even prior to that, since Indigenous peoples were given the opportunity to influence colonial politics with our rights to vote, being the last demographic of this society being given the right to vote in 1960, that the influence of Indigenous peoples on legislation and policy has been immense. From just environmental protection standards that started from regional fight, because we are under the jurisdiction of the federal government, when we advocate for policy shifts in our regions, they have cascading effects across the country. And so our capacities to influence policy and legislation for energy, for education, for conservation and management, from water rights, and there have been dozens and dozens and dozens since the 1960s, when Indigenous people started getting legal counsel and launching litigation to lobbying efforts done by the National Indian Brotherhood, which is now the AFN, by ITK, by MNC. And while there are issues with these strategies continuing to empower colonial systems, do not get it twisted. Indigenous peoples have had tremendous and broad-reaching impacts on policy and legislation for the better in this country. There was a report done by Indigenous Climate Action, Indigenous Environmental Network, and Oil Change International that looks at how Indigenous land defense, it's called Indigenous resistance to carbon, has not only effectively mitigated carbon from being in the atmosphere, but it has led to transformative policies for the better protection and management of ecosystems across North America. Our people have been critical voices and advocates, not just for our own communities, but for the safeguarding of our lands, territories, and Mother Earth as a whole for future generations. You can look at some of these really great examples in specifically the policies for just transition in the Just Transition Guide, where we have seen countless communities really influence this, whilst like policy shifts in the government, whether that's the healthy environment, healthy economy, or the Pan-Canadian framework, or the Sustainable Jobs Act, but communities like the Hatigwai that are advocating for sovereignty and self-determination. This is critical because we cannot just be continuing to regurgitate and give power to colonial systems. We need to be pushing for sovereignty and self-determination. I've talked about this a couple of times. Particularly, I love the mention of like we don't have a common definition of what decolonization is. But what I can tell you is that the government is trying to degrade decolonization to what I'm calling indigenization. There has been tremendous work in this country for indigenization. Indigenous voices, Indigenous peoples are invited to countless tables where they're asked to provide their knowledge and give recommendations, but we have not been given power. We are not a part of the final people putting pen to paper to determine the last words in policies, but we have absolutely, without a doubt, unequivocally influenced countless policies within just transition, environmental management, biodiversity management, water systems, education, economic systems, like Clayton mentioned. And it's impossible to avoid the fact that we are major players when it comes to policy reform. I would say that we are only second to one group, and that is oil and gas lobbyists.
Thank you, Ariel. I am feeling so inspired after this panel. Everyone had such great insights, and it was such a privilege to, gather with our kin here today. And so with that being said, we do have a question in the chat before I pass the floor over to our panelists for their closing remarks. And I'll open this question to any panelist that wants to speak to it. It says, in regards to the sustainability of Indigenous peoples' movements and the sociological impacts of colonization affecting Indigenous people sovereignty, what is not receiving the attention it needs? And how does that impact our ability to develop effective policy? So that is a long question. I'm going to type it in the chat, but if anyone can speak to what's not receiving attention that it needs and how that affects policies for Indigenous people, feel free to jump in.
I'm going to answer really quickly. I think that the thing that happens with this type of thing is we end up seeing people focusing on the trauma of our communities. We are pushed into trauma porn, and there's not enough emphasis on the power that our community has. We focus on how we're being harmed and all of the harms rather than focus on the power of our rights and our knowledge systems. That's what needs attention. We need to be moving to a place of empowerment, not this continued focus on the harms, because we are powerful people with powerful knowledge and powerful rights frameworks. And that's not to say that we have to pretend that those harms didn't happen and are not happening. We need to be talking about those in a framework of reparations and restitution, not just truth and reconciliation, but true reparations for all of the harms that have been caused to us, so that we can adequately empower the rights frameworks and the knowledge we have, that's what needs attention. I'm so tired of people wanting to be like, oh, Indigenous peoples are the victim, they're the victim, they're the victim. And yes, we are the victim, but we are so powerful. The fact that we are sitting here today is a testament to the power of our people.
We
I'd
love
like
it.
to jump into really
Yes, go ahead, Ace. Go ahead.
Yeah, really quickly, I just want to like say that what I've observed a lot in like who's invited into like events or just spaces, or like who's prioritized in the list of community members, you know, for whatever purpose that like non-Indigenous spaces want an Indigenous person present for, you know, like we're all familiar with the song and dance that is often expected of Indigenous people when they show up to literally anything, like whether it's a table to discuss or whether it's an event to open. Like there's a very specific set of expectations for like what an Indigenous person brings, that tokenization. Yeah. And so I think that that's a really big problem with how people regard Indigenous people, because that's not only a tokenization that's demeaning, it's also pedestalization. And what I see is a lot of Indigenous leadership that have specific reputations in their own communities for causing great harm. It's never really like a consideration for people that aren't actually interested in our people as human beings. And I think that a humanization of Indigenous people, it requires more than just a pedestalization of us as like spiritual leaders. And I think that that's still racist. And I think that that's still demeaning. And if we're going to find a place in the world that as Ariel, you know, puts it, is like that actually holds power, it's going to be as human beings, and it's going to be based on the legitimacy of our systems and their functionality and their like incredibly loving, empathetic nature to fellow human beings that will platform members of our community that don't fit into that very narrow demand that a lot of non-Indigenous spaces have of Indigenous people, which is, you know, show up and do your prayer, do your dance, do your song if you must, and then that's the only, and that cultural revitalization actually doesn't have political implications whatsoever. And that's why it's so popular, because it makes people feel good, but it doesn't actually have an impact on how you're empowering anybody, because it's not about the human being that's there, it's about what they represent, and that is political, but not openly. And so it's just another one of those lies that we're told as Indigenous people. It's like, you have a place here, but as long as you're absolutely harmless. And I think that that's, you know, as also Ariel was saying, that difference between decolonization, naming decolonization, and just talking about systemic racism, because there's a narrative of systemic racism as being removable from systems in a harmless way, whereas there's like no narrative of decolonization, of removing colonialism rather, in an equally harmless way. And that's what happens when you humanize Indigenous people, when you see just how unwilling my people will be to leave pivotal pieces of territory that may or may not have things that colonizers want from it. You know, that it gets not cute very quickly. And I guess I've just experienced a lot of you know, spending time on front lines. It becomes really clear really quickly like what colonizers are willing to accept from Indigenous people, and we have a very short leash. And I think it's important for more of us to realize what the implications of that are, like what that dynamic actually is, because it is about power, and it is about a narrative that we've subscribed to colonial systems because they're better than ours, because they're more sophisticated, and that's a lie that our people are told constantly. And no one's going to realize that that's a lie if it's not going to be us. So yeah, I'll end that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ace. That reminds me of that quote that's like, they want our culture, but not our struggles. And that's so accurate. Clayton or Freddie, did you have any points to say to this before we go to closing remarks? What's missing in our policy conversations in the just transition?
Yeah, maybe I could jump in really quickly because I know we're on time, but Actually, no, I won't say that because we're running on our own time. I think what's missing is you can't decolonize a colonial system. So how are we talking about what our versions of systems are? And I think that that's something that isn't readily accepted. The systems that we're trying to fit in right now and trying to function in, they don't work for us. So how are the people who are in those systems working to understand that and supporting us to lead and create our own pathways to sovereignty, to different ways of being, to different ways of knowing? I think it's been mentioned by numerous folks today, like we're tired of having to advocate just to be able to function in a way that works for us within these spaces. So I think it's also about upholding accountability from policymakers, from allies, from just all folks about how are we actually talking about doing things differently. That means sacrifice of living in the way that has been and that continues to be. We have to start reimagining and rethinking what Indigenous futurisms look like, what Black futurisms look like, how we are upholding intersectionality within these spaces. I think that's something that needs to be accepted, but actually acted on, not just spoken about. Mercy.
Thank you, Freddie. That's so important, you know, reconciliation. I love that you said that. Clayton, do you have any comments?
No, I think what was said has been really good. I just think that you know, there's so much work to be done. There's no shortage of work, eh? And however we look at that, if we tend to observe that circumstance from a glass half full perspective or a scarcity perspective, then chances are we're going to have a hard time overcoming things, right? That's a pretty disempowering place to do work from. So it's really important that when we're approaching, whether it's influencing policy or whatever, that you know, we maintain our faith, that we have confidence, and that we're like, you know, when we're representing that energy is there, you know, that we're rooted in our land, in our language, in our culture. For us men, that we're going to the women in our communities and getting direction. That's how you achieve all your wildest ambitions, by getting direction from women, at least in Cree culture. And so, yeah, you know, I think that that's really important. Just that we have, you know, that we're rooted in our ways when we go about this work, because it's really easy, you know, to get kind of hopeless, I guess. It's really easy to get, you know, I'm not saying don't be angry. We all have a right as Native people to be really frustrated and angry with things, eh? Just don't let that get used against you to shut your voice down, or the message that you're bringing out to the world, you know? And the way that we do that, the way that we like put that confidence out, is by like asking for help from our ancestors. So you can't see, for those of you that are watching right now, but behind me, there are hundreds of ancestors, and they're with me like 24 hours a day, and they're with you. Even when you're, doing embarrassing things by yourself, they're there. So, you know, in that way, we have protection, and, you know, we have to have faith in that, because that's what's going to see us through the hard times. And we have to reignite that energy. And one of the ways that we do that is by making sure and going to the land and spending time there, you know, and harvesting and cooking good food over a fire. You know, we've got to do that stuff too, on top of fighting the good fight at the front line, or we lose sight of what we're fighting for.
Love that reminder, Clayton, to, you know, take some self-care. These conversations can be really heavy. Policies can be really tough conversations for our people to have. So I hope everyone's hydrating and can maybe get outside after we're done our webinar. But With that, I'm going to pass it over to Ariel for closing remarks, and we'll just go through the panelists from there on out. Just a reminder that we'll be following up in an email for a draw for $75 if you fill it out within a week. And we'll also be sending our socials and stuff like that following up. So over to you, Ariel.
I just want to say, Masicho, thank you to all of the panelists, to the organizers for this event, and just say, like, looking at the Just Transition Guide is a really great resource if you want to get deeper into these conversations. But more importantly than some document to read, it's reconnecting with yourself, with your spirit, and with your community that will find answers that you can't find in a document. And I think that reconnecting with our culture, identities, and place is a critical part of what it means to find real, tangible, Indigenous-led solutions for a just transition. It's not going to come from sitting in an office and reading reports. So thank you, Masicho. Hi.
Thank you, Ariel. Ace, I'll pass it to you next.
Yeah, I think I remember when I was in Montreal for COP, and I had a couple interviews with like CBC or something, and in both of them there was like this moment where the person who was interviewing me kind of said, like, I don't hear a lot of hope in your voice, Ace. And it was like kind of an accusatory thing, and I think that's very related to what I have to say, but also the way that I speak. So I do feel the need to clarify, at the very end here, like I'm through my relationships to the people that I've met in this line of work, through my cousins, my family, and my community and my land, like I'm filled with hope. I'm very grateful to live at this point in history. I believe that we are all here alive at this moment for a reason. I don't think it's a mistake, and I think that we live at a very interesting and pivotal time where our decisions really have always made an impact, but in this particular moment have a specific kind of impact on the future of all of our territories. And I'm just so fueled by everyone that works alongside and around me, and we really do need each other, and we're not just working for one individual future. Like it's all of our futures at this point, and there needs to be a unity of that, and a centering of humanity in that, because we're all connected by our love for children. Basically, like our children, they're the reason why we're doing all of this, and we can all share that motivation, and that's really significant. So I think that as long as we continue to have courage to speak the truth, and to speak with honesty about what we see in the world, that's what all functional legal systems are based off of. Like that's what will produce a healthy community, is an ability to show up and trust in your relationships to the point where you feel protected by them. And it's hard, and it's kind of unfamiliar, I think, especially at this point in time. But that's really the most immediate fight I see, is just creating functional community again, and especially for Indigenous communities. Like that looks a specific way, given our very recent history with the fracturing of our communities. So I just really respect all the people who do that work every day, because it does take courage, and yeah, I think that's me.
Thank you, Ace. You're such a well-spoken speaker. I'm so literally inspired by you. I'm 26, so you being 23 just blows my mind. I can't imagine being such a awesome speaker at that age. Freddie, I'll go to you, and then after that, we'll go to Clayton. And I know we're over time, but if folks want to stay on to get a peek at the graphic recording, if Elena has time to, oh no, she actually has a flight. Oh no, she thumbs up. So we'll go to Freddie for her closing remarks, then Clayton, and then we'll look at the graphic recording with Elena. Over to you, Freddie.
Marcy, Santana, yeah, I'm so grateful to have been a part of this space. This work comes from such a place of love and care for community and for kin, and it's really powerful to have been on this panel with these amazing speakers. So merci to you all. I think I just leave it with a few questions. How does the work that you do uphold your ancestors? How does the work that you do consider future generations? How does the work that you do include and care for Mother Earth? How does the work that you do ground and center your community? And how does the work that you do uphold your spirit in whatever way that means to you? Yeah, those are questions that I'd pose to all of you, and when thinking about any work and things that you do. So, Kichi Mercy, yeah, really grateful for the space.
I love it. Those are such thought-provoking questions and leaving our panelists with some homework. Over to you, Clayton.
Yeah, final remarks. Well, I just want to lift my hands up to Sacred Earth Solar and to Indigenous Climate Action and all the staff and communities that you work in service of. Press on, keep doing the good work. And a lot of us out there in the periphery, we support you, and we will answer the call when you ask us to help out. Whether it's influencing policymakers like decision makers, or any other element of dismantling white supremacy and systemic racism, a significant part of the undertaking rests in reconciling, which has been historically an extractive and colonial relationship, which Canada continues to impose on our people, on our land, and on our water, and now our climate too. And so colonialism caused climate change, and the economic paradigm that, oh shoot, I lost my freaking word here. Anyway, the point is I do believe that hold on a second here, my notes just went off my screen, sorry. I think that, like other social movement sectors, play a really key part in knocking the power imbalance over and leveling the playing field here in Canada, and in particular labor. I'm always calling the big unions out. I was there. I was the national organizer during 2012's Idle No More, and I was asked to help organize their campaigns by the 4 founding members and by the social movement apparatus that emerged around them. And unions got involved in that, but very quickly they pulled away when they should have opened up their war chests to, invest in Indigenous leadership in a cross-pollination way, like I was talking about in my earlier comments. And I think that there's tremendous opportunity for not just big labor, but other social movement sectors to, do the good work in acting in solidarity with Indigenous social movements. And I say this because, in Canada, 85% of our population is white presenting. In other words, they look like they come from Europe. Okay, so a lot of these conversations and the national discourse and the hollowness that people are experiencing with the truth and reconciliation discourse is because of what Ariel's talking about, that, it's pretty meaningless without reparations and restitution. That's cart before the horse kind of a situation. I tell people, though, that, that's a useful, uncomfortable feeling, and we need to make things even more uncomfortable to stop business as usual. Okay. And so it's really important that, we escalate, that we bring to the forefront what the public isn't seeing, and that we expose. For example, I have to name the RCMP right now because they've murdered, I think it's 8 to 11 of our Native people across the country, or 9 people in the last 11 days. The RCMP continues to be the strong arm of the settler colonial state of Canada. They use them in Wet'suwet'en. They use them, all across the country. And we have to, our friends in labor and our friends in the women's movement, our friends in the Black Lives Matter movement, our friends in all social movements need to stand up right now and help us to hold Canada to account and to stop these cops from killing our kids, because when they do it in the city, they get caught. When they do it on the res, it's a lot more invisible. you know, and other communities of color, brown and black communities experience that invisibility as well, and even some poor disenfranchised white communities. And so we got to come together with the organizing methodologies that organizations like ICA and Solar, Sacred Solar Earth are sharing with us, like, for example, through the Just Transition Guide. And we got to do the work, folks. So I thank you so much for having me here. For those of you that are going to be in Climate Week in New York City, I look forward to seeing you out in the streets. And for everybody who's tuning in right now, again, I look forward to running to you out in the streets and out on the lands.
Clayton, you have such a strong message with such a soft demeanor. It's really, captivating to listen to. Thank you for being here today. Now I'm going to pass it to Elena to share her graphic recording and to share about the work she does with her organization, GISCAT. Do you have screen sharing?
I do have screen sharing abilities. Thank you. So hi everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you guys are zooming in from. My name is Alina Starrett. I am a graphic reporter that is based out of Tecumseh, so Kamloops, BC, but I'm Gitxsan. I'm from Hazelton, BC. That's where my land is, that's where my community is. And I am a graphic recorder. So what I do is I come in and sit on really awesome meetings like this, and I get to listen and witness the conversations and the stories and the questions that are being asked. And it's been a really good process for me for my reconnection. Same as Ace, I'm also 23 and I started this business 3 years ago. So I've been removed from my land and my community for quite a long time. And this is a really good reconnect for me. Another big thing for me is Delgamuukw versus British Columbia is actually a very big part of my family history. My uncle, Earl Muldoe, is actually Delgamuukw, and my grandfather worked on it as well. His name is Neil Starrett. And so land back and our sovereignty and solutions to ensuring that Indigenous people have a responsibility and accountability to the land based off of our oral history is right up my alley. So I'm very excited to be here with you guys. This graphic that's up right now is to show what we did on the first day. So this is just kind of a synopsis, a recap of what we were talking about on our first webinar that we did. For the second one, this is our second webinar. We were talking about keeping it clean. And so again, the graphic recordings are just a bit of a capture, a synopsis of what you were talking about, big ideas, highlights, things like that. And I like to show the ones that I did a couple of weeks ago because on the day of, obviously I'm writing very fast and I'm drawing very fast, and so it's not as clean and put together. So the first two are really good to show you what they're going to look like when they're cleaned up. Where this one is our kind of recap of today, and I have lots of notes as well that I'm going to be adding in. So for a little overview, earlier we were talking about what a just transition looks like beyond just having renewable energy, like solar panels and things like that. So we wanted to ensure that we are upholding our Indigenous sovereignty and our self-determination, ensuring that there's a restoration of our culture, rights, and ways of being, and using generational knowledge to support that. Our Indigenous relationship to land and ensuring that our policies are moving towards pan-Indigenous. And then I put support underneath that just to kind of show like the base of what we're talking about is to support those points up top. So making sure that Indigenous voices are front and center, defining what Indigenous definitions look like, and then also supporting one another as a community. Up at the top here, it's going to be what does policy look like for Indigenous people? And I talked about making sure that there's equitable and fair partnerships, making sure that we have owner and co-ownership of these policies. Communities inform policy and policy informs community, I think is a really good merging of the two. We can't step away from the colonial culture, unfortunately, but we can ensure that we can make relationships and know that our knowledge is the ones that are supporting these colonial policies. So we're working on it, but it's a big step to go towards. And then over here, our language shapes the concepts of our policy. I think this was really important to include that our language communicates with Mother Earth. It's not the English language, it's not whatever other languages that are out there. They're important, but I feel our traditional and our languages are the language of Mother Earth. And she speaks through us, and so that needs to be represented. And that moving home was one of the most powerful things for one of our attendees. And then a couple more things, walking into worlds, losing our language is an extinction. We are the experts of adaptations, little blurbs and bits and pieces that represent the work that you guys are doing. So that is what I did today. I will take some time to clean it up, and then I'm really excited to show and share with you guys the final graphics.
Thank you so much, Elena. We're so excited to have you here for each of our webinars, and we can't wait to get them up on our social media. Support Indigenous business. If you need a graphic recorder, definitely hit Elena and Giscat up. She was amazing. And so I guess for housekeeping, the only thing to mention is, again, we're having a draw for $75 if you fill out the survey within a week, which will be sent to you via email. And thank you to all of our panelists, to our ASL interpreters, Indigenous Climate Action, and to the rest of our team at Sacred Earth Solar for making this happen. They were such insightful conversations that I'm going to carry with me. Thank you all so much. And again, hydrate, go for a little walk, take care of yourself. And we hope to see you next time if we host further webinars. Thank you so much, Miigwech.